Welcome, dear listener. Please set your volume to a gentle level, close your eyes, and allow your body to rest in stillness. Together, we will drift slowly into sleep. Tonight begins our first story in the series of Boring History for Sleep. Let the quiet rhythm of words guide you into calm. If you enjoy this journey, please like the video and subscribe for more. Now, let us begin with the training drills of samurai warriors. In the quiet mist of medieval Japan, the life of a samurai was not filled with constant battles or heroic duels, as romantic tales often suggest. Instead, much of their existence was occupied by long hours of repetitive training, a rhythm of discipline that shaped not only their bodies, but also their minds. The samurai were expected to prepare themselves for war at any moment, and the way they did so was through a structured series of drills that demanded patience, endurance, and attention to the smallest details. To understand these practices is to see not the excitement of clashing swords, but the dull persistence of daily routine. The training ground, often a simple courtyard or a wooden hall, was where this routine unfolded. A young trainee might begin before sunrise, standing barefoot on cold earth, waiting for the call of his instructor. The drills usually started with posture, for the foundation of every skill was how one held the body. A samurai was taught to remain balanced with feet slightly apart, shoulders relaxed, and the spine straight. The student would repeat this stance over and over, sometimes holding it for long stretches of time, learning to endure discomfort without shifting. It was not about speed or force, but about stillness and endurance. After posture came footwork. Step forward, step back, slide to the side, return to the center. The repetition seemed endless, as the goal was to create a natural movement that required no thought. Hours would be spent walking lines drawn in the sand, practicing how to shift weight silently, without stumbling, without hesitation. This was how a samurai ensured that in battle, his feet would obey instinct without confusion. The wooden sword or bukken was introduced only after the body had shown control. With the bukken in hand, students began practicing cuts. Downward cuts, diagonal cuts, horizontal strikes, each repeated hundreds, even thousands of times. The sound of wood slicing through air became a dull rhythm, echoing day after day. It was said that a single proper cut required years of repetition before it could be considered reliable. These drills were not glamorous, but they forged the habits of movement that defined mastery. Alongside sword drills were exercises with the bow. Archery was a vital skill, and yet the training was slow and methodical. A student would draw the bowstring, hold the position, and release not at a target, but simply to feel the control of the motion. Precision mattered more than force. Some schools trained their pupils to shoot while kneeling, others while walking, so that the act of firing an arrow became second nature in every circumstance. This too required endless practice, often in silence, with the archer repeating the same gesture until the muscles remembered it better than the mind did. The drills extended beyond weapons. Meditation was considered part of training, and students were told to sit motionless for long periods, focusing on breathing, calming the mind, and observing thoughts without reacting to them. This mental discipline was no less important than the physical one. A samurai who could not master his own mind would fail to master his blade. Thus, long sessions of quiet meditation were as much a daily drill as sword practice. Physical conditioning was another layer. Lifting stones, climbing hills, running long distances with heavy armor, these were all integrated into the routine. The exercises were plain and repetitive, designed not to impress, but to strengthen the body for endurance. A battle might last hours, and stamina mattered more than brief displays of strength. Every drill reinforced this reality. War was not about single moments, but about lasting through long hardship. Instructors, often older warriors, maintained strict oversight. Correction came not with loud scolding, but with simple demands to repeat the drill again and again. If a student's stance was wrong, he was told to begin anew. If his cut was uneven, he was required to repeat it 100 more times. The cycle was relentless, and many found it monotonous, but that was precisely its purpose. Through monotony, the samurai learned patience. Through repetition, they learned precision. The drills also extended into etiquette. The way a samurai bowed, the manner in which he entered a room, the proper sequence of serving tea, all were rehearsed with the same seriousness as combat exercises. For discipline was seen as one whole, and a warrior who could not control himself in daily rituals could not be trusted in the chaos of war. Day after day, season after season, these drills continued. Young samurai grew into adulthood, surrounded not by the thrill of battle, but by the dull rhythm of endless practice. They lived in a world of repetition, where every gesture was rehearsed until it no longer required thought. Theirs was not a life of sudden glory, but of slow shaping, a patient carving of the body and the spirit into an instrument of obedience. And so, when the rare moment of combat arrived, they moved with a calm that came not from excitement, but from the quiet certainty that every action had already been drilled into them countless times before. When one imagines the life of a samurai, it is tempting to think only of duels at dawn, banners waving in the wind, or heroic charges into enemy lines. But for most warriors, the truth was shaped in much quieter ways, through unending drills that were rarely spoken of and hardly ever celebrated. After the fundamentals of posture, footwork, sword cuts, and archery, the training expanded into areas that revealed how much of a samurai's life was devoted not to fighting others, but to fighting against his own impatience. Consider the spear, or yari, which was one of the most practical weapons of the battlefield. Young men would be made to carry spears taller than themselves, their arms straining not because of the weight, but because of the repetition. They practiced thrust after thrust, step after step, until their shoulders burned and their legs ached. The instructor cared little for speed or flair, only for steadiness. The motion had to be direct, unwavering, and identical to the last. 100 thrusts, then 100 more, sometimes until nightfall, all performed without question. If a student allowed his grip to weaken, he was corrected immediately, not with punishment, but with another order to repeat the drill from the beginning. It was a test of endurance, and the monotony was part of the lesson. Equally repetitive were the naginata drills. The naginata, a polearm with a curved blade at the end, demanded fluid control of wide arcs. The student would stand in a simple yard, swinging the blade in circular motions again and again, each arc cutting through air but touching nothing. The circles had to remain smooth, the transitions seamless, the weight of the weapon fully controlled. Day after day, the sound of swishing air was the only reminder that training was underway. In time, the movements became so ingrained that the warrior could wield the naginata without conscious thought. This was the goal, not excitement, not showmanship, but complete absorption into habit. Beyond weapons, another layer of training emphasized balance and restraint. Some schools required their pupils to walk across narrow wooden beams while wearing full armor, not to simulate combat, but simply to strengthen the sense of balance. Others had them climb ropes or stone steps endlessly, carrying loads that forced their muscles to adapt. These drills were not designed to thrill, only to harden. They ensured that when exhaustion came during real battles, the samurai would not falter. Yet the monotony extended further still. Calligraphy, for example, was not considered separate from martial training. Students practiced writing characters with brushes, holding their wrists steady, repeating the same symbols until their hand no longer shook. The discipline of brushstrokes was thought to mirror the discipline of sword strokes, and so one could not be neglected. Again, hours of repetition defined the practice, and again, mastery was measured not in sudden leaps of progress, but in the quiet improvement that came with time. The daily rhythm of these drills created a life that was predictable to the point of tedium. Wake before sunrise, prepare the body, attend the courtyard, rehearse movements, pause for meditation, return to practice. Repeat until the body reached its limit, then sleep early to begin again the following day. Meals were plain, conversation limited, distractions minimal. The monotony itself became a teacher, reminding the samurai that the path of discipline was not meant to be entertaining. In this way, training was less about becoming strong than it was about learning to endure the dull weight of endless practice without complaint. Some records note that older samurai, those who had survived years of this routine, moved with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural. They did not rush, they did not panic, they simply acted as they had been trained to act, as if their entire bodies had been carved into instruments of repetition. A cut from their sword was not dramatic but precise. A step taken on the battlefield was not improvised, but predictable, and even their manner of speaking carried the quiet rhythm of someone who had rehearsed discipline more times than he could count. To the outside world, this might have seemed lifeless, but to the samurai, it was proof that training had taken root. Thus, the drills of spear, naginata, balance, and even calligraphy were not seen as separate from combat, but as the very core of what made a warrior unshakable. The excitement of sudden battles could last minutes, but the routine of training lasted a lifetime, and it was within that monotony that the true shape of the samurai was formed. In the long corridors of samurai life, there were drills that extended beyond weapons, and physical conditioning, reaching into the routines of discipline that were designed to touch every corner of existence, so that the warrior would not simply train in combat, but in the very act of living. A samurai was told that his spirit must be as disciplined as his hand, and so daily exercises in patience, humility, and ritual became part of the training just as much as the clash of wooden swords. One of the most common yet least celebrated aspects of this training was etiquette, and although to the modern mind it might seem distant from warfare, to the samurai it was inseparable. Every bow, every greeting, every movement in the presence of a superior was rehearsed again and again until it carried no hesitation. A student might spend hours practicing how to kneel properly on tatami mats, how to fold his hands, how to draw his sword only to a precise angle when saluting, and how to sheath it again with equal care. None of these drills involved combat, yet they were enforced with the same strictness as weapon practice, because they cultivated self-control. A warrior who could not control his body in the small details of life was thought incapable of control when life and death hung in the balance. Another drill, equally monotonous, was the endless repetition of armor dressing. Young trainees were required to put on their armor piece by piece, in the same order every time until the process was automatic. Chest plates, shoulder guards, shin protectors, helmet, straps tied and retied until they no longer needed to think about the sequence. It was not unusual for instructors to demand the student put on and remove armor dozens of times in one day, so that the ritual became as natural as breathing. The reasoning was simple. In battle, there would be no time for hesitation, no room for confusion, and so the drills of preparation mattered as much as the drills of fighting. Alongside these physical rituals was the cultivation of voice and silence. Samurai were instructed to speak with restraint, never rushing, never raising their tone beyond what was necessary. This too became a form of drill, where students practiced reciting passages of text in calm, measured rhythm, not for poetry, but for the mastery of breath and self-restraint. Hours could be spent repeating a phrase, the instructor listening only for steadiness of tone, correcting any sign of agitation. Such training seems unusual to those who imagine the samurai only as warriors with blades, yet it reveals the reality that every part of their being was subject to repetition, even their words. Beyond etiquette and voice lay another realm of practice: strategy games. Samurai were often required to study board games such as Go, not merely for leisure, but as deliberate training. Sitting still, placing stones on the board, thinking many moves ahead, this too was a kind of drill. The hours passed slowly, the lessons were not dramatic, but the habit of patience and foresight was strengthened. It was believed that just as the mind learned to predict in games, it would predict in battle, and so the monotony of sitting across a board was valued as much as the monotony of sword strikes. Then there were the endurance drills of silence. Entire days could be spent in enforced quiet, students carrying out their routines without a word, acknowledging each other only through bows. Silence was not an absence, but a discipline, teaching the young warriors that they could remain composed without chatter, that they could carry their duties without complaint. In this silence, every small sound, the rustle of clothing, the shuffle of feet, the creak of wooden floors, became magnified, and the student learned to move with care. Such training was invisible to outsiders, but it shaped the samurai into men whose control reached deeper than the battlefield. The repetition of bowing, of dressing armor, of speaking slowly, of sitting silently, might appear dull to those searching for action, but within this dullness, the samurai found strength. Their lives were carved by drills not only of blade and bow, but of posture, voice, silence, and patience, each demanding the same steady attention, each pressing upon the mind the same lesson. Mastery was not found in bursts of effort, but in endless repetition. And so the days rolled forward, one much like the next, the cycle of practice continuing in quiet rooms and empty courtyards, forming warriors who were defined not by moments of glory, but by the ceaseless rhythm of discipline. Among the many layers of samurai training, there were also drills that connected the warrior not only to his body and his mind, but to the environment around him. For the samurai was expected to be in harmony with the world he inhabited. A large part of training involved familiarity with weapons, armor, and etiquette. Yet beyond those structured exercises lay the quieter practices of observation and awareness. Students were taught to walk slowly through gardens, forests, or temple grounds, focusing on each sound, the chirp of insects, the rustle of leaves, the distant flow of water. Though it may seem unrelated to combat, this exercise in attention was as important as the endless sword cuts, because a warrior who noticed the smallest detail was less likely to be caught unaware in the confusion of battle. This training in awareness was often combined with drills in night vision, where students practiced moving in dim light or under moonlight, adjusting their eyes to darkness. Hours could be spent walking across wooden floors without making them creak, or stepping on stones without disturbing the balance. Such exercises demanded patience and repetition, and while they may have appeared uneventful, they instilled a sense of calm alertness that became second nature. Another form of drill extended into the practice of breathing. Long before combat arts were framed in modern terms, the samurai understood that control of breath was control of self. Students were told to inhale deeply, hold the air, release it slowly, and repeat the cycle without haste. Breathing exercises could last for hours, sometimes conducted in silence at dawn, sometimes during the stillness of midnight. The monotony of repeating the same rhythm of breath cultivated steadiness, a hidden strength that allowed the warrior to remain composed under pressure. Instructors emphasized that if the breath was controlled, the body would follow, and so this too became a daily drill, as essential as the thrust of a spear or the drawing of a bow. Alongside breathing came chanting. Certain schools required their students to recite passages of poetry, prayers, or philosophical texts, not for spiritual comfort alone, but to reinforce rhythm and focus. The chanting, repeated endlessly, was a drill of voice, breath, and mind working together. The dull repetition carried no excitement, yet it created uniformity, and in that uniformity, the warrior found stability. The day of training could also involve drills in restraint, such as holding a position for long periods. A student might be told to kneel in seiza, the traditional sitting posture, for hours without moving, his legs growing numb, his back aching, while the instructor observed. The goal was not endurance of pain for its own sake, but the cultivation of composure under discomfort. A warrior who could remain still when his body demanded to move was thought better prepared to remain calm when his life was at risk. It was one more lesson taught through monotony. Equally dull but equally important were drills in cleaning and maintenance. Every piece of equipment, from armor plates to sword blades, required careful upkeep. Young samurai were assigned the repetitive duty of polishing, scrubbing, oiling, and reassembling their gear. A single mistake in tying a strap could mean disaster in battle, and so the habit of maintenance became its own drill, carried out slowly, deliberately, and repeatedly. The routine of cleaning after every practice session, polishing after every use, and preparing for the next day was unbroken. Through this ritual, the samurai learned that readiness was not a matter of sudden action, but of constant quiet preparation. These environmental, breathing, chanting, posture, and maintenance drills reveal a truth that outsiders often miss. The life of a samurai was not filled with the chaos of constant fighting, but with the calm repetition of daily practice. Each exercise, no matter how simple or dull, carved discipline into the body and mind, until the warrior became less a man of impulses and more a vessel of habit. The monotony of observing a garden, of breathing in silence, of chanting lines, of kneeling in discomfort, of polishing the same blade day after day, might seem uneventful to the modern imagination, but for the samurai, it was the essence of training. It was in these small and unremarkable drills that the foundation of their strength was built, and it was by repeating them without end that they shaped themselves into men who could face chaos with unshakable calm. As the training routines of the samurai expanded over years of repetition, there emerged another layer of practice that was neither purely physical nor purely spiritual, but a slow merging of both, forming a kind of daily discipline that reached into every corner of existence. One of the most common but least noticed of these drills was walking practice. Students were told to walk at a measured pace, heel first, then toe, with each step placed deliberately, neither rushed nor lazy. They would cross the same yard dozens of times, Then repeat the exercise indoors across tatami mats, learning to move with equal calm in silence and in sound. This drill was not about speed, nor even about distance, but about consistency. Instructors demanded that the pace remain steady, the posture unbroken, the steps even, no matter how long the exercise lasted. To some it may have seemed tedious, but to the samurai, it was part of learning how to embody patience in movement. Equally monotonous were drills in drawing the sword, known as yaijutsu. A student might spend an entire day practicing nothing more than the action of pulling the sword from its scabbard and cutting downward in one smooth motion. Hundreds of repetitions, sometimes thousands, each motion checked for precision. The hand had to grip correctly, the blade had to emerge without catching, the cut had to land at the proper angle. There was no opponent in these drills, only the repetition of one gesture until it became inseparable from the body itself. Instructors often reminded their pupils that the moment of drawing the sword could decide life or death, and so it was drilled into them until it became instinct. Then there were the drills of endurance that blurred into the daily rhythm of living. Students were told to carry heavy buckets of water up long flights of steps, not once but many times, not as punishment, but as routine. Others were assigned to chop wood, haul stones, or dig soil. Repetitive labor that built strength and stamina, while also training the mind to endure dull tasks without resistance. These exercises were no less important than sword or spear drills, for they created a body accustomed to hardship and a mind that accepted monotony without complaint. Alongside such labor came the study of discipline in writing and reading. Samurai were often expected to copy text by hand, character by character, page by page. The repetition of brush strokes, the patience required to copy without error, the focus on small details, all of this was itself a drill. The connection between writing and combat may not be obvious, but the principle was the same. Mastery came not from bursts of effort, but from the steady hand shaped by repetition. A warrior who could copy 100 lines without losing focus could also endure the repetition of strikes and steps in battle. Another often overlooked drill was waiting. Students were sometimes made to sit in silence for long stretches, while instructors delayed the start of training. The exercise was not accidental, but deliberate. It was a test of how well they could remain composed when nothing seemed to happen. Hours of stillness, the body tempted to fidget, the mind tempted to wander, but the rule was simple: remain calm, remain still, remain ready. This too was part of discipline. For in real life, a warrior often spent more time waiting than fighting, and the patience learned in waiting was as valuable as the skills learned in motion. Over time, these countless drills merged into a life shaped by repetition. Walking slowly, drawing the sword repeatedly, carrying water, copying texts, waiting in silence, all of these became the fabric of daily existence. The young trainees who once found them dull began to accept them as natural, until their very identities were tied to routine. To be a samurai was not to live in the excitement of constant combat, but to live in the quiet weight of unending practice. Every gesture, every breath, every step was shaped by the same lesson. Control comes not from sudden strength, but from discipline carved through repetition. And so, day after day, year after year, the samurai drilled not to impress, not to entertain, but simply to prepare. Their lives measured not by glory, but by the slow rhythm of practice that never ended. As the years passed in the life of a young samurai, the endless pattern of drills became not just a method of training, but the very rhythm of his existence. For every morning, every evening, every season repeated the same cycle of preparation, repetition, and reflection. The lessons of discipline were reinforced not by grand lectures, but by the quiet monotony of tasks that seemed to carry no immediate excitement. One such drill involved the tea ceremony, a practice that to outsiders might appear as a leisure ritual, but which to the samurai was another exercise in precision and self-control. Every gesture, from the folding of cloth to the placement of the cup, was practiced with unwavering attention. Students were required to repeat the same motions dozens of times, correcting even the smallest deviation, for the philosophy behind the ritual was that mastery of detail, in calm moments, would prepare the mind for steadiness in moments of chaos. Hours of arranging and rearranging utensils, of bowing at precise angles, of pouring water with exact rhythm, created an atmosphere where discipline seeped into the smallest aspects of life. Another drill that stretched into daily routine was the endless copying of strategic maps. Apprentices were told to draw the same map again and again, tracing rivers, mountains, and roads with slow care, memorizing not only the geography, but the act of methodical observation. The point was not artistic beauty, but the cultivation of a mind that noticed details and retained them. A warrior who could copy a map from memory was thought better prepared to understand the shifting lines of battle. This too became a ritual of repetition, and as the pages accumulated, so too did the discipline of careful observation. The training also extended into drills of sound and silence. Students were told to sit in a hall while an instructor struck a drum or bell at irregular intervals. The task was to bow or respond only when the sound came, requiring long patience in waiting and sharp attention to the moment it arrived. Hours of sitting in stillness, alert yet unmoving, shaped an awareness that was steady but never restless. The repetition of waiting for sound and responding in measured fashion cultivated a composure that could be carried into any situation. Another monotonous but essential drill was sword maintenance. Not merely cleaning, but the ritual of disassembly, inspection, and reassembly was treated as a form of training. Each step had to be performed in the same order, the same rhythm, until the act became instinctive. A blade was wiped with oil, checked for nicks, polished until it gleamed. The scabbard was examined, the fittings tightened, the handle bound carefully. To the outside eye, it was no more than daily upkeep. But to the samurai, it was another drill in discipline, ensuring that readiness was never compromised by neglect. The body, too, was subjected to endless drills of posture under weight. Young warriors were made to hold positions while carrying sandbags or wooden poles, standing in horse stance until their legs trembled, their backs ached, and yet they remained unmoving. Such endurance exercises were rarely glamorous, but they carved strength into the body in a way that no sudden effort could match. The repetition of stillness under strain taught the lesson that power was not about bursts of energy, but about quiet resilience. Meditation continued to weave through all of these routines, not as a separate practice, but as a constant companion. Before drills, after drills, and sometimes during them, students were told to return to their breath, to observe thoughts without clinging, to remain calm regardless of discomfort. The monotony of sitting in silence for long stretches was itself a drill, perhaps the most subtle yet the most profound, for it trained the mind to remain steady when everything else seemed restless. By the time a samurai had spent years within this structure, he no longer distinguished between drills of combat, of ritual, of silence, or of labor. All became one seamless routine, one long practice of repeating small actions until they were absorbed into the body and mind. Life itself became a drill, each day blending into the next, the cycles of walking, bowing, breathing, cleaning, and waiting forming an unbroken chain. The samurai who emerged from this life was not defined by sudden passion or dramatic gestures, but by the quiet strength of discipline shaped over years of monotony. It was this rhythm, slow and steady, unchanging and repetitive, that formed the true heart of the samurai way. In the continuing rhythm of samurai training, one discovers that the drills did not end with weapons, armor, etiquette, or meditation, but extended further into the subtleties of daily life, where every action, no matter how ordinary, was treated as another opportunity to rehearse discipline. The very act of eating, for instance, became a kind of practice. Meals were simple, often consisting of rice, vegetables, and soup. Yet the way they were prepared, served, and consumed was regulated by a quiet order. Students were told to sit properly, to raise the bowl with measured care, to chew slowly, to place utensils down with precision, and to finish every grain of rice without waste. This was not about indulgence, but about respect and control, and it reinforced the lesson that even the act of nourishment could be turned into a drill of patience. Another seemingly plain but important drill was the tending of gardens. Samurai were often assigned the care of small plots of land, trimming plants, sweeping paths, arranging stones, and raking sand in precise patterns. Day after day, these repetitive tasks cultivated both the eye and the hand. The steady rhythm of pulling weeds, of smoothing earth, of arranging pebbles one by one, echoed the monotony of sword strokes or archery draws. And through this labor, the students learned to value consistency over speed. The garden became not merely a place of beauty, but a training ground where patience was grown alongside plants. Writing and recitation continued as part of the routine. Some schools required students to copy entire passages of classic texts or to memorize lines of philosophy, repeating them aloud in steady rhythm until they could recite them without effort. The copying of texts was often performed on cold mornings or late evenings when the mind was tempted to wander, but the demand was always the same: remain steady, remain focused, complete the task. The monotony of brush against paper, line after line, taught the same lesson as the endless repetition of strikes with the bokken. Mastery was born of consistency. Physical conditioning was also woven into the daily cycle, in forms that might appear uneventful but that built resilience over time. Long-distance walking was one such drill. Students were instructed to march for hours across uneven terrain, not quickly, not with urgency, but at a steady pace, maintaining posture and breath. The purpose was endurance, not spectacle, and the repetition of steps across hills and fields carved stamina into the body, slowly but firmly. Carrying loads of firewood or buckets of water often accompanied these walks, reminding the trainees that strength and patience were forged in simple labor. Another important drill involved restraint in sleep. Students were sometimes instructed to rise in the middle of the night to perform simple tasks such as sitting in meditation, practicing silent footwork, or holding a stance. The interruption of rest was intentional, a reminder that discipline must extend beyond comfort. Though monotonous, the habit of obeying routine, even when the body longed for sleep, trained the samurai to remain composed under fatigue. These night drills, quiet and uneventful, were as much a part of training as daytime practice, and they impressed upon the student that discipline was not bound to the hours of sunlight. Even the act of travel could be shaped into a drill. Samurai were required to carry messages between villages or to accompany their instructors on long journeys, and during these walks, the expectation was not conversation or distraction, but steady silence and observation. The monotony of endless roads, the repetition of footsteps, the routine of stopping at the same inns or temples created another form of practice, turning travel into an extension of training. Through these daily routines, the life of the samurai blurred into an existence defined entirely by drills. Eating, gardening, writing, walking, sleeping, traveling, all became exercises in patience, all repeated without end. To the outsider, it might appear as though nothing exciting happened in these lives, but that was precisely the point. For the strength of the samurai was not in sudden bursts of energy, but in the quiet endurance of monotony. By the time a trainee grew into maturity, his days were indistinguishable from one another, a long chain of repetition that carved discipline into every corner of his being. It was within this unchanging rhythm that the samurai found stability, and it was through these unremarkable drills that they prepared themselves for the rare moments when calm discipline was needed most. The deeper one looks into the training of the samurai, the more it becomes clear that the true strength of their way was not in grand battles or sudden feats of courage, but in the endless layers of quiet repetition that filled every hour of their lives. Beyond weapons, beyond etiquette, beyond meditation, there were drills designed simply to shape the rhythms of daily existence into patterns of control. One of these was the management of time itself. Apprentices were expected to rise before dawn, to begin training with the first light of morning, and to retire early in the evening, all in strict sequence. The structure of the day was itself a drill, for it demanded obedience not only to the instructor, but to the clock of discipline. Meals, study, practice, rest, all were bound to the same routine, so that the passage of days felt like the turning of a wheel, steady and unbroken. Another drill of daily rhythm involved the maintenance of weapons racks, armor stands, and training halls. Young samurai were required to sweep the floors each morning and evening, to polish the stands, to dust the weapons, to repair the straw targets used for archery, and to replace worn mats. These chores were not glamorous, yet they were treated as essential, for the order of the environment was thought to reflect the order of the mind. The endless sweeping of floors, the repetitive polishing of wood, the regular replacement of worn materials, all became an extension of training, another cycle of monotony designed to instill care and steadiness. A further aspect of training was the cultivation of listening. Students were sometimes told to sit in silence while their instructors recited long passages of history, philosophy, or rules of conduct. They were not allowed to interrupt or respond, but simply to absorb the words, to remember, and to later recite them. This drill of passive listening, repeated day after day, cultivated patience and focus. The act of sitting still for long periods, of absorbing details without drifting into distraction, was as demanding as any physical exercise. In the same way that endless sword strikes taught the body to obey, endless listening taught the mind to remain attentive, even in monotony. Another repetitive drill involved observation of nature. Students were directed to sit at fixed spots for hours, watching the way wind moved branches, how shadows shifted, or how animals behaved at different times of day. The task was not to interpret, but simply to observe, to train the eye to notice change in subtle details. Over seasons, these drills of observation cultivated a deep familiarity with the environment, reinforcing the belief that awareness of the world outside was as vital as control of the world within. Alongside observation came drills of restraint and speech. Students were limited to a few words per day, or instructed not to speak at all outside of training. The restriction of voice forced them to communicate through gesture, to bow, or to remain silent altogether. The monotony of withholding speech was another way of shaping discipline, teaching the young samurai that words must be measured and that silence itself was a form of control. Yet another drill, plain in appearance but demanding in execution, was balance training. Students practiced standing on one leg for long periods, or balancing on narrow beams while holding weapons. The monotony of holding still, the strain in the muscles, the repetition of trying again after failure, all of it taught stability. Over time, the student learned to control both body and mind, holding balance not just in posture but in attitude. Instructors often reminded them that balance on the training beam prepared them for balance in the chaos of life. Taken together, these drills, timekeeping, sweeping, listening, observing, silence, and balance, seem simple, but they formed the hidden structure of the samurai path. They were not about glory or excitement, but about enduring the endless cycles of discipline without resistance. The young men who practiced them learned that strength was not the product of brief effort, but the fruit of years of repetition. By the time they reached maturity, their lives were indistinguishable from their training, for every day, every action, every breath was part of the same rhythm. To live as a samurai was to live within this monotony, to accept it, and to find in its quiet repetition a foundation strong enough to withstand both the weight of battle and the weight of life itself. As the structure of training grew deeper with every year of repetition, the samurai came to understand that their path was not about sudden achievement, but about the slow accumulation of habit through the most ordinary of drills. And among these practices, there were many that appeared to outsiders as little more than chores, yet were treated with the same seriousness as swordplay or archery. One such drill was the constant repair of armor. Students were required to stitch torn straps, replace frayed cords, polish metal plates, and mend helmets, sometimes taking apart entire suits only to reassemble them again. A process that could take hours and would be repeated again the next week. The monotony of threading needles, of tightening knots, of polishing edges, reinforced patience and attention to detail. Another drill focused on sharpening blades, not once but again and again, until the act of whetting steel against stone became a rhythm that could last for hours. The repetitive sound of grinding was steady, and the instructor demanded consistency of angle and pressure, for even a small mistake could weaken the blade. These exercises were not about excitement, but about slow, deliberate mastery. In addition to maintenance, students were tasked with drills in carrying messages. They were told to memorize long instructions and deliver them word for word without change. To strengthen this skill, they repeated the memorization of texts daily, reciting them aloud, then silently, then writing them down. This drill trained not only memory, but also precision, for a message carried incorrectly could cost lives. The monotony of repeating lines until they were fixed in mind was another form of discipline, pressing the importance of accuracy into the students' very habits. Another subtle drill was the practice of anticipation. Instructors would sometimes strike suddenly with a stick or clap without warning, and the student was expected not to flinch, but to remain calm. To reinforce this, they were made to sit for long stretches while unexpected sounds, movements, or distractions occurred around them. The test was not in reacting, but in not reacting, in holding composure against surprise. The repetition of these tests day after day taught the body to remain steady and the mind to remain undisturbed. Yet another drill involved the seasons themselves. Training did not pause for heat or cold, for rain or snow. Students practiced in summer sun until sweat drenched their robes, in winter frost until breath turned to mist, in rain that soaked clothing, and in wind that cut across their faces. The monotony of training in all conditions ensured that the warrior was prepared for any weather. This too became routine, a lesson that the world outside could not be controlled, but the response of the body and mind could be drilled into steadiness. Endurance drills extended further into fasting. Students were sometimes instructed to eat very little, to endure hunger while continuing their tasks without complaint. This practice, repeated regularly, cultivated control over desire and resilience under deprivation. It was not about punishment, but about shaping the will, and it reminded the samurai that strength came not only from what was consumed, but from what was resisted. Alongside fasting came drills of wakefulness, where students were told to remain awake through an entire night in meditation or silent observation, resisting the pull of sleep. The monotony of such vigils pressed upon them the lesson that discipline did not rest when the body wished for rest. Over years of repeating these practices, repairing armor, sharpening blades, memorizing messages, resisting surprise, training in all seasons, fasting, and keeping vigil, the life of the samurai became inseparable from discipline. Every act, no matter how dull, was treated as a lesson, and every lesson was learned through repetition. To live as a samurai was to live within these endless drills, to accept the monotony as the foundation of strength, and to find in the dull cycle of repetition the calm certainty that when battle finally came, their bodies and minds would obey without hesitation. In the final picture of samurai life, when one looks not at the legends or the battles, but at the quiet structure of years upon years of repetition, it becomes clear that the true essence of their way was found not in moments of sudden action, but in the endless monotony of drills that shaped every day into an act of discipline. By the time a samurai reached maturity, he had spent thousands of hours drawing a sword, walking the same lines, bowing at the same angles, polishing the same blades, kneeling in the same postures, and sitting through the same stretches of silence. His life was a cycle that rarely changed, and yet it was precisely this lack of change that created his strength. One of the final and perhaps most profound drills was the contemplation of death. Students were told to imagine their own mortality, to rehearse in the mind what it would mean to die, and to do so not once but daily, again and again, until the thought no longer provoked fear. This meditation, repeated through years, became another drill, training the warrior to remain steady even before the certainty of death. Alongside this was the drill of service, where young samurai were made to assist elders or perform menial duties for their lords without question. The tasks were often mundane, carrying water, fetching supplies, tending fires, running errands, and yet they were treated as seriously as martial drills, for they taught humility and obedience. Over time, this repetition of service erased selfish impulses and replaced them with habit. Another concluding drill was the keeping of journals. Students were required to write reflections on their training, their conduct, their failures, and their progress. Night after night, lines were written, often repeating the same lessons, the same observations, the same vows to improve. The monotony of journaling became another form of practice, teaching self-examination and reinforcing discipline through words. This too was part of the cycle, a quiet task repeated without end. Over the years, the accumulation of all these drills, combat, etiquette, labor, silence, observation, meditation, service, and reflection, merged into one seamless existence where every act was training. The samurai did not distinguish between life and practice, for to them life itself was practice. Waking was a drill, walking was a drill, speaking was a drill, and even resting was approached as another form of discipline. To the outsider, it might have seemed lifeless, but to the samurai, it was the foundation of calm strength. When battle finally came, rare and unpredictable, they did not rely on sudden inspiration or improvisation, but on the quiet certainty that every movement, every breath, every thought had already been rehearsed thousands of times before. Victory or defeat mattered less than composure, and composure came only from repetition. Thus, the training drills of samurai warriors, though dull in appearance, became the essence of their way, carving not only warriors of skill, but men of patience and endurance. And when the days of training gave way to the end of life, the samurai left behind no single moment of glory, but the quiet legacy of discipline lived daily, a rhythm of practice that echoed long after battles had been forgotten. And so our story has come to an end. Before we move on, I kindly ask you to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these quiet journeys alive. Now let us drift further into history as we continue with the next tale in our series of boring history for sleep. Tonight, we arrive at the naval routines of Phoenician sailors. In the ancient world, long before the rise of Rome or the spread of Alexander's empire, the Phoenicians carved their place in history not through conquest, but through the steady rhythm of the sea. And to understand them, one must look not at legends of adventure, but at the daily routines that filled their ships with order. The Phoenicians were seafarers, traders, and navigators, but behind the image of daring voyages lay an existence shaped by monotony. For every day aboard their wooden vessels was bound by discipline, repetition, and quiet labor. A typical day on a Phoenician ship began before sunrise, when the horizon was still dark and the sea carried the heavy silence of early morning. Sailors would rise from simple mats laid upon the deck, rubbing stiffness from their bodies, and immediately set to work with no thought of comfort. The first duty was inspection. Every rope, every knot, every wooden plank was examined to ensure that nothing had loosened in the night. The sailors moved slowly but deliberately, touching, tugging, and tightening. This was repeated daily, for the sea allowed no negligence. Next came the sails. Heavy linen or woolen sheets were unfurled or adjusted depending on the wind, and men pulled at ropes with practiced rhythm, their bodies moving in unison. These drills had been repeated so often that even half-asleep sailors knew the sequence without hesitation. Loosen the ties, pull with steady force, secure the rope against the mast, and check again. The monotony of these movements defined the morning routine, and only once the ship was properly set did the crew take a small meal of bread, dried fish, and water. Eating was quick and without ceremony, for food was not pleasure but fuel, and the day's labor waited. After breakfast, the real work of the day began. Some sailors were tasked with maintaining the oars, scraping off salt deposits, and smoothing the wood with oil to prevent cracking. Others inspected the cargo, often amphorae filled with wine, oil, or grain, making sure nothing had shifted or broken. Still others polished bronze fittings or bailed out water that had seeped into the hull during the night. These tasks were dull and repetitive, yet they were the lifeblood of survival. A Phoenician ship could not rely on luck. It relied on sailors who repeated the same tasks day after day until they were done without thought. Midday brought navigation drills. The captain or navigator would instruct younger sailors to observe the position of the sun, the angle of shadows on the deck, and the steady rhythm of the waves. Stars were memorized through recitation, with older sailors repeating names and positions, while younger men echoed them back. This too was routine, carried out so often that it became second nature. The Phoenicians were famed navigators, but their mastery was not born of genius alone. It was forged in the monotony of daily observation, drilled into memory through endless repetition. Afternoon was often devoted to maintenance of nets and ropes. Sailors sat in small groups, weaving fibers, tying knots, repairing tears, and twisting cords back into shape. The steady rhythm of hands working rope created a quiet hum across the deck, a sound as constant as the waves. Others ground grain for the evening meal, filled water jars, or patched sails. Nothing was left undone, for the smallest neglect could grow into disaster on the sea. As the sun lowered, the ship slowed into evening routine. The sails were adjusted once more, ropes were coiled, tools were stored, and the deck was cleaned of scraps. The sailors gathered for another plain meal, sitting in silence or exchanging only a few words, conserving energy for the next day that would be much the same as the last. Finally, as darkness fell, a rotation of watch was set. Some men lay down to sleep, while others stood at posts, scanning the horizon, listening for changes in the wind, watching the stars. This too was a drill, repeated every night, ensuring that vigilance never faltered. The cycle of waking, working, eating, maintaining, and watching defined the lives of Phoenician sailors, a life of monotony where every day mirrored the last. To the modern imagination, their voyages may seem filled with discovery and excitement, but to the men who lived them, they were defined by routine, by endless small tasks repeated without end. It was this discipline, this rhythm of monotony, that allowed the Phoenicians to master the seas. and it was within these unchanging routines that their strength as sailors was forged. When we look more closely at the daily life of Phoenician sailors, it becomes clear that their survival depended less on heroic gestures and more on the dull rhythm of repeated tasks that bound the crew together in quiet order. After the early morning inspections and adjustments had been completed, the ship settled into the long hours of day, where monotony was the truest companion. One of the most important routines was the care of water, for fresh water was precious, and every drop had to be guarded. Amphorae and jars were checked daily, lids resealed, surfaces wiped clean of salt, and sometimes the water was poured out and strained through cloth to remove impurities. The men repeated this with quiet diligence, for they knew that careless handling would mean thirst later on. Side by side with this came the routine of rationing food. Dried fish, salted meat, grain and bread had to be measured and divided evenly, each sailor receiving his portion without excess. The overseer repeated the same pattern of distribution day after day, calling each man forward, handing him his share, and recording the amounts. There was no variety, no indulgence, only the steady monotony of eating the same meals under the same rules. Another repetitive duty was the repair of the hull. Salt water worked its way into wood relentlessly, and so sailors spent hours driving wedges into gaps, smearing pitch into seams, and hammering nails that had loosened. The smell of tar, the sound of hammering, the sticky touch of pitch became part of the rhythm of the voyage. Each repair was small, but together they kept the ship afloat. It was not exciting work, but it was survival, and the men performed it with the same steady repetition every few days. Navigation, too, was a daily routine, not only in the grand moments of plotting courses, but in the endless practice of small observations. Younger sailors were taught to watch the flight of birds, the color of the water, the direction of waves, and to recite what each sign meant. They repeated the same lessons morning and evening, chanting them under the guidance of the navigator until the knowledge was fixed in memory. To them, the sea was not chaos, but pattern, and they learned those patterns through repetition. In the heat of midday, when labor grew heavy, the men sometimes sang work chants, low and steady, to keep oars moving together. These songs were not for entertainment, but for rhythm, each phrase repeated again and again until the movement of arms and the sound of voices blended. The oar drill was one of the most monotonous of all. Push forward, pull back, keep time with the beat, never rushing, never slowing. Hours of this created not excitement but endurance, and the Phoenicians endured because of such monotony. As the day continued, tasks rotated. Some men polished bronze tools until they shone, others stitched sails with coarse thread, repeating the same motions for hours. Nets were spread out, holes patched with practiced fingers, knots tied and retied until they held fast. The sound of rope against rope, of thread through cloth, of wood creaking under pressure, became the quiet background of life at sea. Even the cleaning of the deck was ritualized, with sailors scrubbing salt and dirt away every evening so the surface remained smooth and safe. At night, the drills of vigilance returned. The watchman at the stern repeated his scanning of the horizon. The man at the bow listened to the water striking the ship. The navigator looked again to the stars, comparing their placement to what he had memorized. Every few hours, they rotated, repeating the cycle of wakefulness through the night. Sleep came in short intervals, broken by duty, and yet this too became habit. The sailors accepted the rhythm of interrupted rest as another drill, another monotony to endure. In all these routines, water, food, hull repair, navigation, rowing, mending, cleaning, and watch. The Phoenician sailors' life was defined by repetition. To live aboard their ships was to live within a cycle that rarely changed, where each day mirrored the last, and each action was performed because it had been performed yesterday and would be performed tomorrow. It was in this monotony, this unchanging rhythm, that their strength as sailors was forged, and it was through these endless drills that they carried their ships across seas that others feared to cross. The longer one observes the routines of Phoenician sailors, the clearer it becomes that their strength was not measured in single moments of daring, but in the quiet persistence of habits, repeated endlessly across days, weeks, and months at sea. After the essential tasks of food, water, sails, and hull were tended, the sailors filled the long hours with drills that to the outside eye seemed uneventful. yet to them were vital for survival. One such drill was the careful management of cargo. Amphorae filled with wine, oil, or grain were stacked in the hold, wedged with straw or cloth to prevent shifting. Every day, sailors descended to check for cracks, leaks, or movement. Each jar was tapped, listened to, and adjusted, the same process repeated voyage after voyage. Even when nothing seemed wrong, the drill continued, for the Phoenicians knew that negligence would invite disaster. Another part of the routine was the endless tying and untying of knots. Sailors practiced binding ropes in dozens of forms, securing sails, fastening cargo, or creating loops for anchors. The instructor might demand that younger men tie the same knot 100 times until their fingers could do it without thought. This monotony created skill, for in a storm there would be no time to think, only time to act, and the body had to obey habit. Alongside knots came drills of rowing. Though the Phoenicians were skilled in sailing, oars were still essential when winds failed. At set times, crews would take up oars, sliding them into water with perfect rhythm, practicing long stretches of rowing even when it was not needed. The stroke was steady, not rushed, each movement identical to the last, so that when true labor was required, the men could row for hours without faltering. The repetition of these drills built endurance not just of body, but of mind. Navigation, too, was treated as an unending exercise. By day, sailors observed the movement of clouds, the patterns of wind, and the direction of currents. By night, they traced constellations across the sky, naming stars, rehearsing their positions, and repeating instructions until they could navigate even with eyes half closed from fatigue. Younger sailors were required to recite the names of constellations in order, pointing to each in turn, their voices murmuring over the deck while others listened in silence. This chanting of stars became as much a part of the ship as the creaking of wood or the slap of waves. Another drill, less obvious but equally important, was the training of balance. The deck of a Phoenician ship was narrow and unstable, shifting under every wave. Sailors were made to walk its length carrying jars of water without spilling a drop, or to climb the mast while holding tools, repeating these exercises until their steps were certain. The monotony of balancing, falling, and trying again taught them to move like extensions of the ship itself. Maintenance of nets also filled the daily rhythm. Although many voyages were focused on trade, sailors always relied on fishing for additional food. Nets had to be untangled, dried in the sun, checked for tears, and patched. The process was repetitive and slow, the same knots tied, the same fibers woven, the same weight tested again and again. Yet this monotony provided sustenance, and without it, the men could not endure long voyages. Evening routines followed a steady order. Fires were lit in small braziers if weather allowed. Meals were eaten, and then tools were cleaned and stored. Younger sailors were often tasked with reciting the rules of conduct: respect for the captain, obedience in danger, silence during orders. The recitations were dull, but repetition carved them into memory, ensuring that in moments of stress, the men would remember their place and duty. As night deepened, watches were assigned. The cycle of vigilance, broken sleep, and quiet observation repeated endlessly, so that every sailor, young or old, came to know that life at sea was less about sudden excitement and more about monotony. Cargo checks, knot drills, rowing practice, navigation recitation, balance training, net repair, evening ritual, and night watch. All of these together defined existence on a Phoenician ship. The rhythm of these drills was not designed to inspire, but to endure, and it was this endurance, born of endless repetition, that carried the Phoenicians across seas feared by others, making them masters not by conquest, but by the quiet patience of routine. Life aboard a Phoenician ship was defined not by sudden bursts of action, but by the unchanging repetition of tasks that filled every hour with quiet labor. And among these duties, many were so ordinary that they would escape the attention of anyone not living them, yet they were as essential as sails or oars. One of the daily drills was the care of the anchor, a heavy stone or metal weight tied with thick ropes that kept the vessel steady when moored. Each morning, sailors checked the rope for fraying, retied knots, and lifted or lowered the anchor in practice, repeating the sequence until every man knew it by heart. The process was slow, deliberate, and uneventful, but its repetition ensured that when the anchor was truly needed, it could be handled without confusion. Another repetitive drill was the distribution and storage of firewood. Small braziers were sometimes lit for cooking or warmth, and so bundles of wood were carried aboard, stacked carefully, and covered to keep them dry. Sailors rotated through the task of measuring, moving, and checking the supply, each step repeated day after day. Alongside this came the monotony of preparing food. Grain had to be ground into flour with small handstones, a process that required slow circular motion for hours, repeated by one sailor after another. Bread was kneaded and baked in simple clay ovens, and fish was cleaned, salted, and stored. These chores were not moments of adventure, but of endless repetition, yet they formed the foundation of survival. Another routine that shaped life on board was the care of clothing and sails. Linen garments were washed in seawater, beaten against the deck, hung to dry, and folded. Sails were patched with coarse thread, stitches repeated over and over until the cloth held firm. Every day, some item required mending, and every day hands repeated the same actions, pulling needle through fabric, tying knots, and testing strength. Even the sweeping of the deck became ritual, with men brushing away salt, dirt, and scraps of food, their strokes forming a rhythm that echoed against the wooden planks. Navigation drills also continued daily. Young sailors were told to note the color of the horizon, the height of the sun, and the shadows cast by ropes and masts. They recited lessons on how to tell direction from wind or from the movement of waves. At night, they pointed to constellations, naming each star, repeating the order until the knowledge was carved into memory. These drills did not change from one day to the next, and in their monotony lay their value. Balance and agility exercises were also repeated endlessly. Men climbed the mast to check ropes, descended again, and climbed once more, sometimes carrying tools or weights to increase difficulty. Others walked the narrow beams of the ship, jars in hand, training their balance so that no movement of the sea could unsteady them. Falling was common at first, but repetition taught steadiness, and soon the sailors moved as if the ship and their bodies were one. Another routine was the endless sharpening and repair of tools. Bronze blades, hooks, and chisels were ground against stone, handles were replaced, and points were checked. Even when tools seemed ready, they were sharpened again, for readiness was drilled into habit. Evening brought the same order as morning. Food was shared, tools stored, and younger sailors were required to repeat rules of discipline. The night watch began, with men scanning horizons, listening to waves, and noting changes in wind. This cycle of day and night, work and watch, repetition and silence, was unbroken. Life aboard a Phoenician vessel did not shift with excitement, but flowed with monotony, and in this monotony lay strength. By repeating the same small tasks, anchor drills, wood storage, food preparation, mending, sweeping, navigation recitation, balance training, and tool sharpening, the sailors created a rhythm that sustained them across endless seas. Their mastery did not come from moments of glory, but from the quiet persistence of routine, and it was within this unchanging cycle that they found the discipline to endure the vast waters that others feared to cross. The Phoenician sailor's life was shaped not only by the visible duties of sails, ropes, and oars, but also by a host of quieter drills that filled every spare moment with repetition. For on the sea, idleness was considered dangerous, and routine was the shield against both disorder and despair. Among the most common of these tasks was the constant drying and storing of goods. Amphorae containing wine, oil, or grain were covered with cloth, checked for dampness, and rotated so that moisture did not collect in one place. This process was carried out morning and evening, with sailors lifting each container, tapping its sides, listening for changes in sound, and adjusting its position. The monotony of this routine created a rhythm that became second nature, as familiar as breathing. Another drill that shaped the daily pattern was the practice of net casting, even when fishing was not immediately required. Sailors would throw nets into the sea, draw them back, check for tangles, and repeat the process until the motions were fluid. They did this not for sport, but as rehearsal. For when food was scarce, they could not afford hesitation. Repetition of the casting motion ensured that in moments of need, the nets would be ready and the crew would move as one. Alongside nets came the repair of ropes. Fibers frayed quickly in salt air, and so sailors twisted strands together, tied splices, and reinforced weak spots. The same knots were tied again and again until fingers moved without thought. The smell of tar and hemp lingered on their hands, a constant reminder that survival was built upon the dull persistence of repair. Navigation training filled more of the long hours. Young sailors were instructed to keep their eyes fixed on the horizon, to measure the angle of the sun with sticks, and to memorize the sequence of stars rising in the east. These drills were not occasional but daily, with knowledge recited and repeated until it became instinct. At night, the men pointed out constellations, chanting their names together in steady rhythm, their voices blending with the sound of waves. The monotony of these lessons was deliberate, for the Phoenicians relied on memory rather than charts, and memory could only be strengthened through repetition. Balance and endurance exercises were also part of the routine. Men walked the length of the ship, carrying jars filled with water, required to complete the task without spilling a drop, despite the rocking of the waves. Others practiced climbing masts, descending and climbing again, sometimes for hours. The cycle of ascent and descent taught not only strength but patience, for every movement had to be repeated until it was effortless. In the same way, sailors drilled in lifting heavy stones or amphorae, moving them from one side of the deck to the other and back again, not because it was needed in that moment, but because the repetition built the strength they would require later. Another monotonous drill was the cleaning of tools. Hooks, knives, chisels, and axes were oiled, sharpened, and wrapped in cloth, even when they had not been used. The process was performed daily, the same sequence of inspection, sharpening, and wrapping carried out until it became routine. In the evenings, after meals of bread, grain porridge, or dried fish, the men sat quietly in groups, repeating prayers or chants to the gods of the sea. These were not dramatic ceremonies, but murmured words spoken with steady rhythm, another layer of monotony that bound the crew together. Finally, the day closed with the assignment of night watch, a routine so repetitive that every sailor could predict its order. Some lay down to rest, others stood alert, watching stars, listening to waves, and waiting in silence. The next day would bring the same tasks again, and the sailors knew it. Their lives aboard ship were defined by this endless cycle of repetition, a cycle that dulled the imagination but strengthened endurance. To live as a Phoenician sailor was to accept that each day would mirror the last, that drills of storage, fishing, rope work, navigation, balance, cleaning, prayer, and watch would repeat without end, and that within this monotony lay the discipline and patience that made their people the masters of the sea. The routines of Phoenician sailors stretched far beyond the practical necessities of ropes and sails, reaching into every corner of life aboard their vessels, so that each moment, even the quietest and most uneventful, became part of a larger rhythm of discipline. After the morning tasks of inspecting cargo, mending sails, and checking ropes, the sailors often turned to personal upkeep, though even this was carried out in a structured, repetitive fashion. Clothing had to be washed in seawater, beaten against the deck, wrung dry, and hung carefully in the sun, each garment treated the same way day after day. Hair was trimmed with knives, nails cut short, and beards combed, not for vanity but for order, for disorder was seen as a weakness aboard ship. These drills of self-maintenance became as regular as the repair of planks or nets, another cycle of small tasks repeated endlessly. Another daily duty was the tending of fire in clay braziers, used sparingly for cooking. Sailors gathered wood, measured charcoal, and fanned flames carefully, repeating the same steps to ensure the fire remained steady. Bread was baked in small portions, fish roasted or boiled, and the process repeated with little variation each evening. Meals were not moments of pleasure, but rituals of sustenance, carried out with the same monotony as every other task. After meals, younger sailors were often made to recite lessons of conduct or repeat navigational knowledge, their voices steady, their words drilled into memory. The repetition was deliberate, for forgetfulness was unacceptable when storms or enemies threatened. Another subtle but essential routine was the collection of seawater for desalination through evaporation, a slow and tedious process requiring patience. Sailors set shallow pans, waited for the sun to leave behind salt crystals, and repeated the process without fail, ensuring they understood how to supplement dwindling supplies. The monotony of watching water slowly vanish taught endurance as much as it provided survival. Training and endurance extended further into controlled deprivation. On certain days, sailors were required to ration themselves more strictly, eating or drinking less, not because of shortage, but as a drill in discipline. The same small portions were distributed, and the men endured without complaint. For repetition carved strength into will as well as body. Another routine that filled the quiet hours was the endless checking of knots and bindings. Sailors pulled on ropes, retied loops, and reinforced lashes, even if they had already been checked earlier. They repeated the process again and again, creating habits that left no space for error. The care of tools was equally repetitive. Chisels sharpened, axes polished, fishhooks examined, even when they had not been used. These habits seemed dull but became instinct, ensuring readiness without thought. Evening brought the cleaning of the deck, with men scrubbing planks, sweeping dirt, and rinsing salt away, their strokes forming a rhythm that mirrored the sea's own. Afterward, many ships held brief rituals of devotion, prayers to Baal or Melkart whispered softly. Repeated words spoken by generations of sailors before them. It was not ceremony of grandeur, but of habit, another drill that bound men together in silence. When night arrived, the cycle of watch began, unbroken and monotonous. Some sailors stood at the bow, scanning horizons, while others remained at the stern, watching stars and listening to waves. Shifts rotated, voices low, movements steady. Sleep came in brief intervals, interrupted by duty, yet this too became routine. Each man accepted that his rest was only ever partial, that his body must obey the rhythm of the ship rather than the desires of comfort. And so, day by day, the Phoenician sailor lived not in bursts of adventure, but in cycles of repetition. Washing, trimming, cooking, reciting, collecting, rationing, checking, sharpening, cleaning, praying, and watching. All tasks blended together until life itself became indistinguishable from training. It was within this monotony that they forged their endurance, and it was through these unchanging routines that the Phoenicians crossed seas feared by others, carrying their ships and their goods farther than most could imagine, not by chance or glory, but by the quiet persistence of endless drills. Day after day, on the deck of a Phoenician vessel, the routines unfolded like the turning of a wheel, each duty blending into the next, each repetition echoing the one before, until life itself seemed like one long, unbroken drill. The morning began as it always did, with sailors stirring from their mats, their bodies stiff from interrupted sleep, and immediately turning to inspection of ropes, sails, and planks. No matter how many times the checks had been done the day before, they were done again. Every knot tugged, every seam pressed, every board tapped. Once this first cycle was completed, another began with the lifting and lowering of the anchor in practice, a motion carried out in the same deliberate order until the men no longer had to think of the steps. Afterward came the ritual of sweeping the deck, strokes repeated in long lines, salt brushed aside, scraps gathered and thrown into the sea. Then, as the sun climbed, the drills of balance began. Young sailors carried jars of water from one side of the ship to the other, required to keep them steady against the rocking waves. Others walked the length of the beam with tools in hand, repeating the task until they could move without faltering. Climbing the mast was part of the cycle too, hands gripping ropes, feet steady against the wood, climbing up and down again and again until fatigue became as familiar as the creaking of the ship itself. When these tasks were completed, the men turned to the care of their equipment. Nets were spread, examined for tears, patched with slow stitches, folded and stored. Oars were lifted, checked for cracks, moiled, and set back in place. Tools were sharpened against stone, the same rhythm of scraping repeated until the edge was smooth. Cargo was inspected as always, jars lifted, tapped, listened to, and replaced. Their positions adjusted with straw or cloth so they did not shift. The same duties had been done yesterday and would be done tomorrow, but repetition was the rule of survival, and the Phoenicians followed it without pause. In the afternoons, drills of navigation filled the quiet hours. The younger men stood with the navigator, reciting the names of stars and constellations, pointing to where they would appear at night. They were taught to note the color of the sea, the movement of birds, and the shape of clouds. Lessons were repeated aloud, the same words spoken daily, until knowledge became instinct. Sometimes the navigator would cover the stars on a chart and demand the students recite their order from memory, a test performed again and again until no mistakes remained. The monotony of these lessons was heavy, but it carved skill into the mind as surely as the oar carved lines into the sea. Evening arrived with another round of tasks. Food prepared, fish cleaned, grain ground, bread baked. Men sat in silence as they ate, the portions small and measured, the ritual unchanging. After the meal, the deck was cleaned again, tools polished again, ropes checked again. Before rest, prayers were murmured, short phrases to the gods of the sea repeated softly in unison, their voices blending with the steady sound of the waves. Then came the night watch, the most monotonous drill of all, as men stood at their posts scanning the dark horizon, listening for changes in wind or water, their eyes fixed on stars whose patterns they had already memorized. One watch ended and another began, sleep broken into fragments, and the cycle continued. There was no part of life aboard that escaped this rhythm. Each day was a mirror of the last, a repetition of inspections, repairs, drills, chants, meals, and watch. It was within this endless monotony that Phoenician sailors built their resilience, for the sea offered no certainty but routine, and only by surrendering to that routine could the crew endure their long voyages. The daily life of Phoenician sailors was an unbroken chain of routines, each one simple, each one repetitive, and yet together they formed the structure that allowed ships to survive long voyages across seas that others feared to cross. From morning until night, the sailors lived within a cycle that rarely changed, and one of the most important parts of this cycle was the constant attention given to the vessel's timbers. The wooden planks of the hull were vulnerable to salt, water, and insects, and so sailors scraped away barnacles, brushed off algae, and applied pitch with steady strokes. They did this again and again, not once a week, but every day, for they knew that neglect would bring weakness. The smell of pitch, the sound of scraping, and the sight of dark resin spread across wood became part of the rhythm of their existence. Another repetitive duty was the storing and organizing of trade goods. The Phoenicians were merchants as much as sailors, and their ships often carried purple dye, glass, cedarwood, or crafted wares. Each item had to be packed, secured, checked, and shifted as needed. Sailors repeated the same routine of lifting, adjusting, and stacking, their movements slow and deliberate. Even when no storm threatened, they performed these checks, for habit was their safeguard. Alongside these tasks came the endless work of rope making and repair. Fibers of flax, hemp, or palm were twisted into cords, strands pulled tight, knots tied and retied. The sailors sat in groups, their hands moving without thought, repeating the same motions until long ropes lay coiled neatly at their sides. These ropes were then checked for strength, pulled and tugged, the drill repeated with monotony until nothing was left to chance. Another routine that filled the days was the grinding of grain and the baking of bread. Small querns were turned slowly, the circular motion repeated until flour collected, then kneaded into dough and baked on heated stones. The meal was plain, the process slow, but the sailors carried it out day after day without variation. Food was sustenance, and the repetition of its preparation was another drill, shaping patience as much as it fed the body. Navigation lessons continued in the same monotonous fashion. Younger sailors were asked to note the direction of waves, to feel the pull of currents, to watch the color of the sea as it shifted with depth. They recited these signs aloud, pointing to examples, repeating phrases until they became instinctive. At night they lay on the deck, eyes turned upward, tracing constellations, repeating their names, drilling the knowledge of the stars into memory. This routine never ended, for the Phoenicians understood that forgetting even a single pattern could mean losing their way. Physical drills were also common. Men lifted heavy jars, carried them back and forth, or climbed ropes again and again, their muscles straining, their bodies enduring the same cycle of exertion daily. These exercises built not sudden strength, but long endurance, the kind of resilience needed when storms demanded hours of labor without rest. Evening came with its own order, nets mended again, tools sharpened again, decks swept again. Meals were taken in silence, prayers murmured, and then the watches began. The same sailors stood in the same places, eyes fixed on the same horizon, ears tuned to the same sounds of water and wind. The cycle of rest and vigilance repeated, broken only by the slow passing of stars overhead. Day after day, week after week, the routines continued. There was little variety, little excitement, only the endless rhythm of maintenance, observation, labor, and watch. Yet it was this monotony that kept the ships afloat, this monotony that allowed the Phoenicians to cross seas and return again. Their power did not lie in sudden brilliance, but in the dull strength of repetition, and their lives at sea were defined entirely by it. As the voyage stretched onward, the routines of Phoenician sailors deepened into patterns so familiar that each man could perform them without thought. And yet these patterns were repeated because they were the only true safeguard against the dangers of the sea. The mornings were always the same, with sailors rising before the sun, inspecting ropes, sails, and cargo, then sweeping the deck in long, slow strokes. Afterward came drills of balance and strength. Jars carried from one side of the ship to the other. Ropes climbed, masts ascended. Every movement carried out again and again until muscles ached, but no one faltered. Once these tasks ended, attention turned to the endless maintenance of the vessel. Barnacles scraped, pitch applied, ropes retied, nets spread and examined. Each of these duties had been performed the day before and would be performed the day after. Yet no one complained, for repetition was the nature of life at sea. Midday brought the rationing of food and water, portions measured carefully, distributed evenly, and consumed without waste. Bread was eaten slowly, fish chewed carefully, water sipped rather than gulped. Afterwards, sailors checked amphorae again, lifting, tapping, and listening, making sure nothing had shifted. Cargo drills were monotonous but essential, for a single broken jar could rot and foul the air. Afternoon was filled with navigation practice. Younger sailors recited lessons on the sun and stars, their voices murmuring while the navigator listened. They pointed to the horizon, traced the movement of clouds, described the flight of birds, and repeated phrases until memory was fixed. At night, these same sailors lay on their backs upon the deck, eyes following constellations as they rose and fell, reciting names softly until they drifted into half-sleep. Another routine that shaped their lives was tool maintenance. Knives sharpened, hooks polished, axes checked, chisels examined, the same motions of scraping, oiling, and wrapping repeated without fail. Even when tools had not been used, the drill continued, for habit was stronger than circumstance. The evenings followed a similar rhythm. Meals prepared in the same way, nets dried and folded, ropes coiled, decks scrubbed, prayers murmured, voices blended into a low chant, words repeated as they had been for generations, prayers to the gods of the sea, whispered with no change in tone or rhythm. Finally, the night watch began. Sailors stationed at bow and stern, some scanning the horizon, others studying the stars, listening to the waves, and waiting for changes in the wind. Shifts rotated, sleep came in short fragments, interrupted by duty, and yet this was accepted as normal. Every man knew his turn would come again, and he would stand silently, eyes steady, ears attentive, body unmoving, repeating the same vigil that he had repeated the night before. This was the true life of a Phoenician sailor. Not glory, not discovery, but monotony. Every action was a drill, every moment part of a cycle that did not change. Ropes tied, decks scrubbed, cargo checked, stars memorized, tools sharpened, prayers spoken, watches kept. The rhythm unending, the repetition unbroken. It was this monotony that gave them strength, this monotony that made them reliable, and this monotony that allowed their ships to cross seas feared by others. Their mastery of the sea did not rest in sudden acts of brilliance, but in the steady persistence of men who lived every day as a repetition of the one before. When one considers the full shape of a Phoenician sailor's life, it becomes clear that the story is not one of sudden adventure or dramatic discovery, but of endless repetition. For their strength lay not in bursts of excitement, but in the quiet acceptance of monotony that stretched across weeks and months at sea. By the time a voyage reached its end, the men had performed the same tasks thousands of times, and yet they continued because survival depended on it. The morning began always with inspection, sailors rising before the sun, pulling at ropes, pressing seams, checking planks, their hands repeating motions so familiar they seemed automatic. The anchor was raised and lowered, not because it needed to be, but because practice demanded it. The deck was swept clean though it had been swept the night before. Food was prepared in the same way, bread ground and baked, fish salted and dried. Water rationed into small equal measures. Nothing varied, nothing changed. After meals, the drills of strength returned. Jars lifted and carried. Ropes climbed, nets spread and repaired. Cargo was checked, amphorae tapped. Their sound compared to the day before. Straw adjusted, positions shifted. Navigation was rehearsed again, constellations recited. Waves studied, clouds noted, birds observed. Young sailors chanted their lessons under the eye of the navigator, their voices repeating words that had already been spoken countless times. In the afternoon, tools were sharpened, oars polished, bronze fittings rubbed with oil. Every item aboard was cared for, as if neglecting it for a single day would bring ruin. Evening brought the same cycle. Cooking fires lit, food shared, prayers murmured, ropes retied, nets folded, decks scrubbed. The sun set, the stars rose, and the night watch began, as it always had, as it always would. Men stood at bow and stern, scanning horizons, tracing constellations, listening to waves, rotating through their shifts while others slept in fragments. Nothing broke the rhythm, nothing altered the cycle. To outsiders, such monotony might seem unbearable, but to the Phoenicians it was strength. For by surrendering to routine, they removed the weight of choice, and by repeating the same drills endlessly, they created habits that could not fail them when storms struck or enemies appeared. The mastery of the sea was not achieved by chance or genius, but by patience. And that patience was built plank by plank, rope by rope, prayer by prayer, watch by watch, through years of repetition. By the time a sailor reached the end of his career, he carried no tales of sudden glory, only the memory of tasks performed without end. Days that mirrored one another until they blurred into one long cycle of labor and silence. Yet it was precisely this monotony that allowed Phoenician ships to cross seas others feared, to carry goods to distant ports, and to return again and again. The true legacy of the Phoenician sailor was not discovery, but discipline, a life lived entirely within routine. And it was through that routine that they became the quiet masters of the sea. As we close the story, remember that true rest comes not only from sleep, but also from how gently we prepare ourselves for it. Try not to go to bed with a heavy stomach. Let your mind settle by putting your phone aside and allow your thoughts to soften. Each small step helps ease you into deeper calm. Thank you for spending this quiet time here. Sleep peacefully, and I look forward to sharing another story with you tomorrow night, here at Sleep Whisper.